Hello everybody, Adrian Plass here.
Yes, and Bridget, hello.
It's getting quite autumn-y, isn't it?
Yeah,
Just
it
at the
is.
moment. Well, it is up here in the north
it's
where
raining
we are.
as well, so that makes it autumn-y.
I think we're entering into words that are not existent.
Anyway,
we know it's number 120 of Sounding the Shallows.
We do.
And we know that a large part of the last few days have been to do with the Queen's funeral and with those
Well, it would be
massive
difficult to
crowds
miss it,
in the
wouldn't
streets.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's left me with so many feelings. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people feel that they're more or less funeral out, that they've seen so much and heard so much and it's been in the news. But, we talked a couple of weeks ago about indelible marks. Well, I think one of the indelible marks for me is seeing the people who queued for, I don't know, some of them 12, even longer hours in the cold and the rain just to be there.
Yeah, it was much less than it was. Oh, sorry, much more than it was when Princess Di was killed. But I remember then thinking something similar. Thinking, I'm a little bit surprised at the overwhelming emotion you see in people, and now it's. I think we said last week it's a slightly more puzzled emotion because it's a very complex loss. But to know that people are travelling, from thousands of miles away, and in this country queuing for hours and hours and hours for the few seconds that they were allowed to walk past the coffin.
And so pleased, so many of them, that they had made that journey, whether it was just on the train or walking down the road to be there. But there wasn't anybody who just strolled in. I mean, everybody, it was a sacrificial wait for a moment in time to have just been there. And there was no communication, was there? I mean, there was between people in the queue.
I think there was quite a matey feel in the queues.
Of course. I meant there was a lot of friendships formed, but I really meant once you got there, there was nothing you could say. And I was thinking about all the funerals that people go to when they travel across the country, maybe just to be at a funeral, just to be there, even though the person is no longer there, is dead. But you want to be there.
Well,
you want to stand
why
there.
aren't we like that? I mean, you might say you are, but I know that I wouldn't have wanted to go to London to queue for hours, not because I didn't care. On the contrary, I really, really have been moved profoundly by what's happened. What is different, I think, about me, which is not better, for goodness sake, but things happen in my head, really. I think I'm less of an actionist when it comes to this kind of thing. I'm more of somebody who retreats into feeling and trying to understand what I'm feeling. And there's a sort of appreciation in that, of spending quite a lot of time trying to work out what you're feeling about someone like the Queen finally not being there. I don't know. I mean, would you like to have gone to London?
Well, I think if it didn't involve a very long, complicated journey that might not have ended up getting in there anyway, yes, I might. I have loved to be in a place where something has happened and allow my imagination maybe to travel backwards and forwards. I'd love to follow the journeys of Paul, for example, and touch base with some of those places.
A friend of ours just phoned, didn't he, say they're travelling around all of the places Paul visited.
That's right.
And I think both of us felt partly a sort of envy, really, to be honest, because we would love to be able to do that.
But with this, I just felt respect, Adrian. I thought, you have stood there and you have waited and you have walked just to pay respect. And sometimes, so often, talking to people, they were standing in for somebody else, weren't they?
Yeah,
for somebody
who
who died, or for somebody. There was one woman in tears because her mum would have loved to come, but she was in an old people's home and it would have been madness for her to be there. for other people it was that they'd been in the army all their lives, and she had been their colonel-in-chief, and
Yeah, that's right.
and they loved her.
Children were there because their mums and dads were there.
Yeah.
One thing it did occur to me was that that vast crowd, that concentration on making sure you are there to express your respect and whatever else you want to express, is that it was one of those statements that needs no words. It was something that was done, and you looked at it in certain wonder and said, what are these people saying? And I think that the Queen would have really appreciated that, because she wasn't allowed to make public pronouncements. But when you look back and you think about one or two of the things she did, the things she did spoke much more eloquently than mere words.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, they were almost a visual aid, weren't they? They were a PowerPoint presentation, if you like, for the world. I mean, there was the time, wasn't there? I think it was to boost the Commonwealth. I'm not quite sure, but I remember the image sent all round the world of her dancing with the President of Ghana. Now, this to us now
that was in
would
1961, wasn't
yeah,
it? She
and the
was
thing
35,
is, and the thing is that now that wouldn't feel like anything. But then, for the Queen, described at the time as a good white woman who is dancing with the black President of Ghana, was saying something.
Yeah,
it really was an example of action speaking
yes,
louder,
it was.
wasn't
Do you
it?
think she'd planned to do that, or
I think,
do you think
she planned most things. I would be intrigued to know, as we were saying last week, whether she, just a little bit of her thought, if I've got to die, I'd like to die in Scotland, just to remind the people of Scotland how important they are to me, to the United Kingdom or whatever. I think she thought a lot. You know, there were so many comments about how well prepared she was in every situation that she was in. So I think she knew jolly well what she was doing. And I mean, what about the situation in Northern Ireland? There were a couple, weren't there? I mean, there was the whole business of Enniskillen. If you remember that appalling bombing in Enniskillen.
Some call it the Poppy Day Massacre.
Yeah.
Some call it the Enniskillen bombing.
Yeah. But if you remember, when she visited this really, really important visit in 2012, she did two things. I mean, the first one was that she crossed the road, didn't she? She actually crossed the road between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And it was the first time a monarch had been into a Catholic church.
I think it was the other direction, which is what's most significant. I know you meant that, but from the Protestant church to the Catholic church.
Does it matter which way?
No, it doesn't really.
I don't think it really does.
But it was her, the head of the Anglican communion, walking over to the Catholic Church.
And the Queen, Queen of the United Kingdom, with quite a lot of people in Ireland still not really.
Was that the first time a monarch had done that? I think it probably was.
I think it was, but then of course
time,
it was the same visit, and I think we may have mentioned this before, but it was the same visit, wasn't it, where she actually, just before leaving, is televised. And I think she may have said, I want this recorded. And she shook the hand of Martin McGuinness. I mean, I think we cannot imagine the effect of that, really. I mean, I remember being very moved by it, but I think for the people of Ireland, some people would have been angry. There's no doubt about that.
Well, I'm sure they were.
To shake hands with the head of the IRA.
It depends what's happened to you in your life and to your family, and on both sides, I suppose. But yeah, it was very significant, and she must have been aware as she did it. All she was doing was going a short distance, shaking somebody's hand.
I know, a moment in time,
and the whole world would see it
and gasp. I think
it would mean something.
Of course, there were times when she needed to be seen and didn't want to be seen, weren't there? Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Diana's death, and I mean, we all know of the difficulty of the fact that she stayed up in Scotland with the boys, with Diana's boys, with Harry and William, And it was only because of the Prime Minister at the time,
Tony Blair.
Tony
wasn't it?
Blair,
Yeah.
persuading her to come
We don't know
down.
precisely what
No, we
was
don't
said,
know, but the point is she had to be seen again, didn't she? It's that symbolic being seen to do things.
Yeah. How odd, though, to be somebody for whom that is so true, that if you make a decision to do something significant, it will be visible and it will mean something. The papers will be full of it, the television news will be full of it, and everybody will have a view on it. I can't say I've experienced that in my life particularly.
There was a placard,
Extraordinary.
somebody was holding up, and I thought this is all part of this being visible. I mean, sometimes placards they're not great, are they? But this one said, if grief is the price of love, responsibility is the price of power. And I thought, for the new king, for the royal family, for anybody who's in a position of power, I thought that was a really good action thing, if you like, a good visual aid.
Yeah. I've never quite. The thing about grief, I've been thinking a lot about grief lately, is the price of love. I mean, grief is something you shouldn't waste, isn't it? We've known a number of people who've lost people recently, and it's heartbreaking. And the grief rings a very tiny bell in the darkest hell when you're in the middle of it, because you're allowed to take something out of yourself and let it go, let it out.
And these things trigger it, don't they? We had an email this week from somebody who we've become very fond of, who was talking about the double death of her mother, really. The death of her mother, but also the symbolic death, if you like, when she lost her to dementia quite a few years before she actually died. A sort of double grief, really.
That's right, yeah.
But she wouldn't have felt that grief if she hadn't loved her mother so much, and that is part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And what about Jesus? And we always want to talk about Jesus when we talk about these things, but
I think he's a very good example.
do you think his actions spoke louder than words?
Well, I think they had to. I mean, you're talking about crowds, and we mentioned before, didn't we, about the crowds trampling. I mean, I think one of the best...
Trampling each other.
And I think one of the best... I don't know, it's just stupid, really, but do you remember in Monty Python, in The Life of Brian, where there's a crowd listening to him?
And one person at the back of the crowd says, did he say blessed are the cheesemakers?
That's right.
Which, I mean, everyone knows, but it was extraordinarily funny.
Well, it was funny because it rings true, because these big crowds, they can't have all heard him. I mean, you think about the wonderful Roman or Greek amphitheatres. Well, most of the time, as far as we can gather, that wasn't the situation.
That's right,
he was in all sorts of places where the acoustics
thousands
would not
of people,
have been
we're
great.
told.
Yeah.
I know my friend John Hall and I always used to joke about the idea that someone is sitting in a church feeling lost and worried about faith, and the preacher says, and the one thing essential, absolutely essential to the heart of salvation is and the voice is lost because the acoustics go wrong. And he doesn't repeat it on that bit. I know, we used to find it
Well, the
very
number
amusing.
of times, Adrian, when we're watching something on iPlayer and we say, what did he say? What did she say? What
Yes,
happened
I know.
then? And then we push it back a bit, so that we can literally listen to it.
We were in
They
a
couldn't do that with Jesus.
Which cathedral was it we were at where the sound stopped working? Somewhere in New Zealand or something. And
It was in
there
Auckland.
were lots of people there. And we were speaking and the sound completely went. And so after that, behind us, there were people crawling about like ants, trying to fix the sound.
There were, while
And
we shouted
the
at
people who were in the congregation were really not concentrating on
No,
us
of
at all.
course
They
they
were
weren't.
watching the sound being fixed. That's one of our less glorious
Yeah, it is
moments,
really.
I'd say.
I mean, even shouting at the top of your voice, things that really are meaningful and emotionally important to you when you're bellowing don't quite work. But I mean, I was thinking, I suppose I've been thinking of this sort of, I don't know, this visual aid idea. And Jesus did it again and again, didn't he? I mean, because not everybody would be able to hear. The moment when, for example, I don't know what you're thinking of, but I mean, when he took a child, a very unimportant person as regards most people in that crowd, many of whom would have been men, and children were not that valued most of the time. And he took him in front of the crowd and said, unless you become like one of these, you're very unlikely to enter the kingdom of heaven. I mean, the shock of that for people. What's he doing? It's a child.
I suppose the other thing about those times is people would have told other people. It would have been talked around. Yes, he did a lot of things, didn't he? The washing of the disciples' feet. Although you have to be a bit careful about that, because I don't think he just thought, I'll do a visual aid. I think he thought, I'll wash their feet because they need their feet washed. But also, it will be saying something much more clearly than I could ever say it. This massive principle that the whole Jesus thing, and we don't understand it really, even those who pretend they do, I don't know what they're talking about, but God became man. Good luck with understanding that. But in other words, as Jesus said, he came to serve, not to be in charge.
Yeah.
And I think getting your head around that is really, really difficult.
It is something the Queen understood.
Exactly. I was thinking that she and he, and we've already said they had things in common, I think they would have said to each other, this has been tough, hasn't it? That you're supposed to be the person who everyone serves and bows down to and looks up to and all that. And you're here actually to be a servant to them. And that's, I like the thought of them meeting.
I think when it comes to that washing of the feet, as you say, Adrian, so much more than just a visual aid. This is something tactile with that little group of his special friends who he so longed to be with for that final meal. And I think they will have had that memory, not just of the water, but of the touch, of the feel of him in front of them. And I think the actual effect of the coffin going past was like that for a lot of people. They've been chatting, they've been making friends, they've been, making their hot chocolate over their funny little stoves and various things, and then suddenly there it is in front of them. And that moment was almost tactile for a lot of people, I think. You could see it in their faces. And I mean, he was leaving them. He knew he was going to leave them, and he knew that Peter in particular was going to go through such a terrible time. But Peter has that memory of the water and the hands on his feet, and the image of saying, "This is what it's about." Yeah.
There are lots of things when you think about it. The walking through the wheat, eating the corn. On the Sabbath day, just doing it. Didn't have to say anything about it.
No.
Just do it. The man with the withered arm in the temple, who he prayed for and brought him out front, knowing precisely what the effect of that would be. Yeah.
He was very concerned that it would be seen, wasn't he? Like the woman who was healed when touching his robe.
Yeah.
He called her out. He didn't need to. She was healed. But he called her out because then everybody would see that she was clean to be able to go into the temple. He was so aware of the value of
it's a massive,
being seen.
Massive amount of self-awareness and very bewildering, really. What were you going to say?
No, I was just thinking, I mean, sometimes these things can become quite empty, can't they? I mean, I don't know. I know lots of people love the washing the feet ceremony, for example, on during Passion Week. I know you hate it because you hate feet, essentially.
Yes,
but I mean, I was thinking, it's not just a badge, is it? It's not just a... It was so much more than that. And if it becomes a sort of empty something... And I was thinking, Adrian, of, what happened to you about the badges, the welcome badge somebody was telling us about. No.
What was that?
When he went to church.
A man who went to church, yes, and he
and he was
hadn't been
greeted
to
very,
church
very warmly.
hadn't been to church for years.
And the man had a big welcome badge and a welcome smile.
That's right. Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, as far as I can recall, he was greeted with huge warmth and thought, this is fantastic, and decided to go back. When he went back, he saw the same man and went up to him prepared to receive the same joyful welcome. And the man said, I'm not on welcoming this Sunday, and hurried off busily because of something else he had to do. So is that what you meant? That's sort of,
I did. That it was an empty symbol, the welcome. It wasn't real. But the great thing about Elizabeth, and I really believe this, she's separated from her crown, isn't she? That is taken away from the coffin.
Yeah.
And then, I know you've said this, Adrian, about Jesus when he welcomes people and they say, I did this, I was that, I belong to this denomination, I thought this, I thought that, and that is my badge.
Yeah. There is no doubt that it will be a waste of time taking out your credentials if you come into that kind of encounter with Jesus, because he will look at you and he will say, you can all take your badges off.
Yeah.
You can take your labels off, and I will tell you what you are, and I will tell you who you are, and you will know precisely who I am.
Yeah.
And going back to the Queen Jesus thing, their stubborn determination to not just have an entitlement, which is what both of them could have, but to be what they needed to be, to say the things that needed to be said, many of them wordless.
Yes.
Because that's why they're there.
Yeah.
And that's a huge responsibility. I don't want to beef the Queen up too much. She's probably embarrassed.
You said you thought she might be.
I think she might be a bit embarrassed. I imagine her finally realising that you're measured. I mean, I'm sure she always did. You're not measured by your what other people say you are, but saying, I do feel a little embarrassed at the moment. All those soldiers with swan's feathers in their helmets. But she did like the ceremony, so perhaps she enjoyed it.
And she chose The Lord's My Shepherd.
Yeah,
and she chose the other hymns.
It was good.
And she hates long,
it was
boring
good and short,
services.
wasn't it? Yeah, 45 minutes. That's the way to do it.
That's a good last thing to leave the world with.
Yeah.
And that she and Philip found long services very boring.
And the Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a pithy but brief sermon.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very good.
I think he could hear the Queen in his ear saying, don't you make it too long.
Get on
anyway, we are finished with the funeral, Adrian. We are finished with maybe talking about the Queen. It's been quite a week, quite a fortnight. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and soon we're getting ready for our little tour in Scotland, aren't we?
We are, yeah. Yes, we are. And your book is actually out, which we were going to say and forgot.
Yeah.
So we'll maybe talk a little bit about it next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.